Hi everyone, this is Shom Shubro, and in this video we are going to have a brief introduction about Spring Framework. So first of all, the question that comes to our mind whenever we see that good looking logo as well as we hear about this, so what exactly is Spring? So if I go by the definition, so we can say it is one of the most popular application development framework for developing enterprise application using Java. And obviously, the developers use Spring to create high performing and easily testable and reusable code. Now, there are lots of jargons in this page, which is high performing, easily testable, as well as reusable code. So, even before we get into that and understand how Spring can help you to do that, let us first understand the first term here, which is framework. So what exactly is a framework? Where do we use a framework? Just think about through a non-technical example which has got nothing to do with Java. If you think about the way in which the bridges used to get constructed, like for example the flyovers and all used to get constructed might be quite some time back, and compare that with today, you will find out that obviously there is a big difference. The difference is that in the previous one, it used to take a long time, and whereas it is taking very little amount of time. Within a few years, a complete flyover is being built, a bridge is being built. So, what exactly has changed? Obviously, in broad terms, we can say that the technology has changed. That has enhanced the speed. That has increased the speed of say building that say bridge or flyover or whatever. But if you look closely enough, you'll find out that they don't build the entire bridge uh, all by their own. Rather, what they do, you'll find out these bridges are being broken into pieces, and those pieces are being, say, built somewhere else, and they are being carried over to that, say, location, and that is being assembled directly. As a result of that, the time is being saved because those pieces are being produced in a mass scale, and obviously it is being assembled over here. So only the time that is required over here is to just to assemble this. And obviously, as we understand that the height and might be the curvature of each of the bridge would be different. So as a result of that, the pieces that we will require would also differ. So obviously, you cannot simply take out one piece from might be one bridge and you can put it into another one. Obviously, that's not possible. The bridge will collapse for sure. Uh, but obviously, we can understand that certain things remain common uh, within those bridges. That is how the suspension works and how what materials are being used. So certain things are obviously common. So now let us take this example into an application development environment. Let's think about a development team which is working on creating an e-commerce portal. Now they might sell might be they might be selling luggage, they might be selling bags, they might be selling laptops, they might be selling mobile phones, whatever it is. But ultimately, there are certain common functionality that exists in that kind of a application. That what we say term as a e-commerce application. For example, there should be a product catalog. User should be able to go through those product catalog and see different product, and they should be able to search for different products. They should be able to filter out different products based on certain categories, right? And after that, they should be able to put these products into their cart, and at the same time they should be able to do a checkout. Similar to that, there should be an administrator of that site who would be able to might be add some new products, might be remove the existing products, and might be update the prices and quantity available or something like that. So if you look at it in one way, each of the type of application or each type of application which we are there in the e-commerce segment has got certain things in common. Now let's take it to the broader aspect. Now let's think about a web application as a whole. I'm not even talking about a e-commerce application. Let's talk about a web application as a whole. Over there also, for each web application that we develop in the industry, we'll obviously have certain things in common. For example, security would be one requirement. That is, who would be able to do what. That means, obviously, I'm talking about authentication and authorization in terms of our web application. Second thing would be where the log would be created. The logging would be a common element that will obviously be there. So these are some of the common aspects which exist for each of the application, and we don't want to reinvent the wheel for every application that we build uh, to perform the same. Because also there is one more thing to tell. You guys obviously know that when clients come to us and give their product requisition, that is whatever they are asking us to build, always they try to say that we want it as fast as possible. Now, if you start doing everything on your own, obviously it will take a whole lot of time, for sure. Hence, and also one more thing to say over here, that is not only it will take a whole lot of time, but also there you have to spend quite a considerable amount of time to find out the quality of that particular application that you have built, those features that you have built, right? uh, the complexity of those say features that you have built, even though those features are going to be used several times for several applications that you're going to build. Instead, if you are using a framework, that can actually help in this kind of a situation. So what does a framework do? It tries to figure out the common aspects, it tries to figure out the common elements across multiple types of application, and it tries to put those functionalities inbuilt, so that uh, whenever you use those frameworks, just by writing the configuration code, you can use those features without writing the entire code in detail. It's just like just let's go back to the previous example I was talking about, that is assembling the parts of the bridge, instead of spending time and building that over there, right? So that's where we get the benefit of using framework. So obviously we get the benefit of being faster because features are already implemented for us. Second thing is that because the framework has been tried and tested, hence you can rely on the quality of the framework. And because every day it is being modified, every day it is being refined, so you can be rest assured that uh, the quality is being taken care of. So that's one more reason why we can use a framework. While we are saying about that, these are the benefits or the advantages of using a framework. There are dark side of the moon also. That is, if you are using a framework, it makes you limited. It makes your imagination or might be your functionalities limited to the features which are already available in that framework, right? So that's one thing that happens whenever you use a framework. Okay, so let's move on. Now that we have gotten a basic understanding of what is exactly framework, so now let us move and try to understand what are the benefits of using Spring framework. Okay, uh, so let's start from the first one. So obviously, Spring will enable the developers to develop enterprise class application using POJOs. So what are POJOs? POJOs are plain old Java objects. That means basic Java class with some variables and might be the getters and setters. Okay, we can use them directly. So the benefit is that you are not exactly following any particular structure of a class. You are not following, you don't need to implement some interface in your class to make it recognized as something. For example, uh, if you talk about Spring, I'm just taking one example, and maybe you are going to create one Spring controller class. I guess you all know by now what exactly is model view controller pattern, the MVC say pattern. So in Spring, if you have to make one class be recognized as a controller, only one thing you have to do is you need to add one annotation called as at the rate controller. That's the only thing that you need to do. So basically, otherwise this class is nothing but a Pojo class, right? So because you are directly working with Pojo class, so you don't need to have a kind of a EJB container product, such as might be any application server, but rather you can directly use it upon any servlet container like Tomcat. Next is that Spring actually is not only one framework, but rather it is one framework that contains a lot of other frameworks, small frameworks. Each framework looks into certain functionality. For example, if you talk about Spring Security, so that looks after only the security aspect. So if you require security to be implemented in your application, then only you use Spring Security. Otherwise, you don't. So Spring is organized in a very good modular format. So as a result of that, you can use only that part of Spring which you exactly require, and you don't need to use the entire Spring and make your application heavy. And like I have already told you, so Spring does not try to reinvent the wheel. Instead, it truly makes use of some of the existing technologies. So obviously, Spring majorly is being used for developing a web application, but obviously it can be used for creating other type of application as well. So if you talk about a typical web application, for example, okay, so we were talking about the e-commerce application for some time, or rather, you might have got an initial understanding of what this activity stream is all about that we are going to build in our program. So over there, if you look at it, if you just think about it, it will obviously have an interface, the user interface through which the user will interact with that application. It will have that application logic, and obviously there will be some data storage that will be stored in some data storage. So it might be some RDBMS, it might be some NoSQLs, okay, or any other format. So, Spring truly can use those features. For example, Spring can use JDBC. Spring uses can connect with any of the ORM tool like might be JPA, JDO, Hibernate, and all the logging framework like Log4j and J2EE, and the view technologies that are already available for you. That is, for example, HTML or might be JSP. So if you are familiar with might be how to create a basic J2EE application, uh, you will find it even more familiar to use Spring as a might be for a web application development framework. Let's move on. Let's move on to the next features. So testing an application written in Spring is very simple because obviously the environment dependent code is moved into the framework itself. What does it mean? Obviously, whenever you are running and you're testing one application on one particular say environment, and might be you are going to run it in another environment, there will be differences. So in Spring, Spring takes care of that. So you don't need to. So as a result of that, testing the application which is written in Spring becomes very easy. And I was talking about the Spring MVC. So Spring's Wave framework is very well designed Wave MVC framework, which we will discuss in might be in our subsequent videos. and it provides a very good alternative to the wave frameworks such as struts. If you know that there are certain shortcomings of the basic MVC, what we call as MVC1, that is over there can be n number of controllers handling n number of say requests. So it does not exactly have one front controller to handle all types of requests. So it's something like you have got might be a building which has got 10 different doors, and might be through those 10 different doors you can access that building, right? So if you have to put in some kind of a security, if you have to put some kind of a audit mechanism, you have to ensure that you put it in all 10, and these 10 gates and the gatekeepers of those 10 gates are absolutely synchronized with each other. The moment there is a gap in synchronization, so there might be issues coming. So that is why we have moved to the front controller design pattern. If you know about struts is developed on top of that. So even if you talk about Spring is also developed on top of the Spring Web MVC framework. So we will discuss about that in our subsequent videos. And obviously, Spring provides a very convenient API to translate the technology specific exceptions. Obviously, when we are working with third party tools, so there would be exceptions say generated. Okay, so if you're talking about might be JDBC, if you're talking about Hibernate, JDO, so they might throw different exceptions of their own, but Spring will translate them into their own its consistent unchecked exceptions, right? So Spring provides a consistent transaction management interface also, so that your transactions are managed, and you ensure that whenever you have a transaction that is being performed across uh, multiple small say statements rather, or say multiple small executions, so that can be managed. So it can manage a local scale transaction also whenever might be you are involving a single database and all, and it can go to a global transaction also, might be JTA and all. We'll discuss about that in our subsequent videos. Now let us go through Spring Framework, the architecture basically, the Spring Framework architecture. So if you look at it, we have got the data access integration, we have got the web, we have got the core container, test, and the AOP aspect and instrumentation. So let's start from the core. So if I move into core, so Spring Core basically has got the core Spring functionalities such as the Spring IOC container and the dependency injection features. Now next comes in Spring Bins. So what are the features that Spring Bins support? So Spring Bins are managed by the IOC container. These are objects managed whose life cycle is managed by the Spring IOC container, and uh, through dependency injection, those bins can be used across throughout our application itself. And context actually defines the entire application context for our application itself. And we have got Spring expression language, about which we will discuss at a later point of time. Now if I get into the data access integration, so Spring can interact with JDBC, Spring can interact with multiple ORM tools, like I have told, it can be JPA, it can be JDO, it can be Hibernate. Spring can work with multiple say OXM tool, so basically the object XML mapping tools, and obviously Spring can work with the messaging services for sending and receiving messages, so handling the messaging framework, and obviously like I've told you, so Spring can handle the transactions. And in terms of web, so Spring can work with the Spring's say web framework that we have, that component, so that can handle the servlet listeners, and all, and it can support this front controller type of implementation for communicating to that application itself. So that obviously we have. And what exactly is AOP or aspects? Let us understand that in a very brief way right now. We will be learning that in detail and with some examples later on. So whenever we talk about aspects, so if you talk about an application and if you try to think about multiple layers of the application, there are certain concerns that comes across all the layers, rather what we call as cross-cutting concerns. So that are not present only in one layer but rather in multiple layers. That is what we call as cross-cutting concern. For example, if you talk about logging will have to be implemented across parts of the application. Similar to that, if you talk about implementation of security, so that also is a cross-cutting concern. So for implementing those, we can use Spring AOP. And lastly, for Spring Test, we can use Spring Test, and obviously Spring provides us a very good way through which we can mock the test data. So using dependency injection, which is one of the biggest feature of Spring, during the execution time of the test, we can actually inject the mock test data to the test cases. So we were talking about inversion of control. So now let us get some idea about what exactly this inversion of control is there in Spring. So it sits at the core of the Spring framework, and it is responsible to create objects and wear them together. Wear them together means where it is being called for and where it actually exists, and obviously configure and manage the complete life cycle from creation till the destruction. So whenever we are talking about these objects that are being managed by the IOCs, so that is what we call as the Spring bins. Okay. Now, the container gets its instruction on what objects to instantiate, configure, and assemble by reading the configuration metadata provided. So this is where uh, one big feature of Spring comes in. It is completely different. How it is being done and what is to be done, those are completely different concerns. So, through Spring, we can use multiple ways to provide the configuration metadata. It can be represented by an XML file, it can be represented by some Java annotations, or even it can be represented by writing Java code. But whatever we write in that configuration, on the basis of that, the Spring IOC container will use some Java Pojo classes and the configuration metadata to produce a fully configured and executable system, or rather an application. So now we were talking about bins. So now let's officially get into the definition of Spring bins. The object or the set of objects that form the backbone of your application. That means the objects which usually stay throughout the entire application context. Uh, Usually, please remember I am using this term usually because not all bins are having that kind of a scope. There are multiple bin scopes also, so we will discuss about them. So, and those are managed by the Spring IOC containers. So that is called a Spring bin. So what is a bin? It is an object which is instantiated, assembled, and managed by an IOC container. So you don't actually create that object on your own by writing a new keyword. Okay. So let's say, for example, if you want, maybe you have got a class in your application called as employee. Okay. So that employee class is might be having three properties, might be name, salary, and designation. Let's say, for example, and you have got the relevant getters and setters for each of these fields. So what will happen? if you want to create one object that will be used throughout the application, so you can create a bin for that employee class. In that case, what will happen? Wherever an object of the employee class will be required, we have got the option of injecting or varying that same bin instance uh, to the relevant places. So in that case, you don't need to create thousands or hundreds and thousands of the objects across your entire application and in each of the places wherever you are going to create it. And no matter how many number of users are creating. So there are multiple bin scopes that we have. So the first one and the default one, which is called as a singleton. If you are familiar with singleton pattern, so which says that for one Spring IOC container, there would be only one instance of that bin. Now, next one is prototype, which says that you actually can have n number of instances of that bin for one IOC container. Now, these two, first and second, these are applicable for all Spring applications. But the next three are applicable for web aware Spring application context. Okay, web aware means, because if you talk about these terms, request, session, and global session, which we call as the context application context. So these would be applicable for only a web application. So from the name itself, you can understand request scope bin will be having a scope of one particular user request. Session scope bin will be having the scope of one particular session, and global session would be applicable for the global application session. Okay, so thanks for joining this session. This was one brief overview of the Spring framework for you. In our subsequent videos, in our next video rather, we will be having a detailed description on Spring Web and Spring Web MVC framework. We will understand what are the components in Spring Web MVC framework, and obviously we will be seeing the architecture, and in that say video we will be also creating one of our Spring application, Spring Web application, where you will understand how all of these are coming together. So thanks for watching this video.